Hello everyone and welcome on The Barricades. This is the most exciting Eastern European leftist show in which we challenge mainstream media narratives about our region. My name is Boyan Stanislavski and I'll be your host for this episode, which will focus on Ukraine and in particular on the looming war in the country's east. As you have most likely heard many times in the news outlets you follow, there is only one explanation for the ongoing buildup, and that is, could it have been anything else? Quote unquote, Russian aggression. Of course, this is not so simple. Russia appears to have little to no incentive to escalate this crisis, whereas the Kiev government appears to have a plethora of them. However, in order to comprehend the current situation, one must first consider the origins of the entire mess as well as the international situation. Last week, I discussed it with Mark Sleboda, one of my favorite geopolitical analysts and international security experts. He is also a former U.S. Navy officer and a senior lecturer in international relations and security studies at Moscow State University. He is an outspoken critic of American imperialism and a frequent commentator on alternative media programs. Mark provides an insightful and comprehensive analysis of the entire situation with numerous historical references and explains in details the fallacy of the dominant narratives about Russia and Ukraine. So enjoy the video and don't forget to like, subscribe, and please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. We are an independent media outlet with no sponsors, so we must rely solely on you. Every penny counts. You can make a monthly subscription by going to our Patreon page, patreon.com/thebarricade. Thank you. Okay, Mark, I want to talk to you about what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of hype, and many people are afraid, and that a real war is looming between Russia and Ukraine. Personally, I think this is rather unlikely to happen because I just don't see how Ukraine is going to do pretty much the same as Georgia did in 2008. That is, attack Russia and lose big time. But things seem to look really serious. On the other hand, I'd like to ask you to perhaps walk us through this most recent build-up that culminated in this rather weird, desperate statement by Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who said that the only way to avoid war is to immediately recognize Ukraine as a NATO member. I would think that's actually a way to exacerbate things and make the situation really dangerous because Russia has also quite clearly signaled that it's not going to tolerate any kind of NATO aggressive movements anymore. What's your take?
Yeah. Okay. So, the first part of that is that, of course, Ukraine is not going to be joining NATO tomorrow, no matter what Volodymyr Zelensky says on TV, and not next week, and not next year, and not in the next 5 years, and probably not in the next 10 or 15 years either. And you're absolutely right that if you actually wanted a major war, then that would be the way to do it, is for NATO to suddenly bypass their own rules and requirements for entry, which include no territorial disputes or internal conflicts in the country, to join. Not that they're not capable of waving it away. I mean, the IMF certainly waved away its own requirements to give funds to the regime in Kiev, and that's how the U.S. and the West have propped up that regime for the last 7 years, is with the IMF spigot. They broke their own rules, and NATO could do that. But there is no internal agreement within NATO about wanting immediate war with Russia, because that is what it means. It is unacceptable for Russia, for Ukraine, or Georgia for that matter, to join NATO. Countries right on its border, with large part of each population sympathetic to Russia, no matter how much their respective political elites in power might wish it weren't so. And Russia, simply, it's a national security red line for them, much as the United States would not accept an enemy military alliance setting up shop in Canada or Mexico, or even Texas, right? If it broke away, it's simply not going to happen. And if it did, it would mean, war. It would mean more than war just between, an internal conflict in Ukraine, and it would be more than war between Russia and Ukraine. It would mean a Russia-West war, which would mean a collective security treaty organization, NATO war, which could blow up into a global conflagration.
Yeah, and could pretty much end our civilization.
That's not going to happen, though. So don't worry about that.
Yeah. Okay. So if that's not going to happen, what are they aiming at? I mean, what's the idea behind this?
The 99.9% chance that is not going to happen does not mean that could not happen. That a major conflict could not result out of this, and this is always the risk. And even a 0.01% chance that what no one wants could happen, right? Is too high, right? And we saw how chains of misunderstandings and events, black swans, can lead to major conflagrations. The classic story of that is World War I, and that's why this situation is still extremely dangerous and should concern everyone. And we don't want to go anywhere near down that road or downward spiral.
Yeah, okay, I get it. But then, there was this action, okay, on the part of Ukraine, the shelling, the breaching of Minsk agreements, and all the rest of it. And I presume the majority of our viewers and listeners, they kind of understand that the narrative propped up by the Western media is actually false, because of course there's a lot of talk about Russian aggression, whereas Russia's just so far been moving its own army within its own borders, right? So it's it's not really the classical definition of aggression. But what I'm trying to figure out here is, what's the reason for Zelensky to actually do this? Why is this all happening? I mean, what kind of perhaps internal conflicts within the Ukrainian oligarchy provoked that? What kind of perhaps international contradictions led to this? Because Zelensky ran basically when he became president, okay, or before he became president, he ran on some kind of peaceful resolution of what's been going on since 2014. And now he seems to have, made a complete change, right, in terms of his approach. So, do you have any idea what could have led to the situation that we observe now?
Yeah. So let's start with let's go back just a sec. And what is the basic confrontation here? The basic confrontation is an internal civil conflict in Ukraine. No matter how much they might try to present it otherwise and talk about Russian invaders and Ukraine's at war with Russia, the primary problem is still that Ukraine is a divided country, divided in its concept of what it means to be Ukrainian. What is the Ukrainian nation? What does it mean to be a Ukrainian? And that is a very different conception in Western Ukraine from Eastern Ukraine. And if you want to talk about a third Ukraine, a central Ukraine, a Kiev-focused Ukraine, they don't actually have a real strong sentiment, and they tend to blow whichever way the predominant winds, the zeitgeist, or the fattening of their pocketbook might lend them. But in Eastern Ukraine, they have a very strong sense that Russia is, first of all, some 40% of the population in eastern Ukraine is ethnic Russian or is mixed, right? It's real hard to say which is what. How many people in your family are ethnic Russian versus Ukrainian. It's real difficult to say. All the way across the former Soviet Union, but particularly in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass. They view Russia as a brother country. They're predominantly Russian speaking, and they have a very strong, particularly in the Donbass, what is derided in the rest of Ukraine, or particularly in Western Ukraine, as a Slovak mentality. They are viewed as Soviet nostalgists, and they are. They feel nostalgia more for the Soviet Union than a lot of people in Russia, because they have not seen a green light at the end of the tunnel. They are still in the 90s, right? The oligarchs were never driven from Ukraine. Their lives have never measurably improved from that moment. Ukraine is still, their politics, their society is still controlled by, a handful of oligarchs. You can count them, like on two sets of hands. And that continues even after the Maidan, perhaps even more so than before. Because now there's less competition. It's more focused on one particular group of oligarchs. And so there's a lot of strong leftish mentality in the Donbass. Now, Western Ukraine comes from a very different perception of Ukrainian national identity. And this is the identity that post-Maidan has now, for the first time, come to dominate the entire country. And we're talking Galicia, we're talking a part of Ukraine that was not Ukraine until just before World War II, where they were actually part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And only right before World War II did they actually become part of Ukraine. They really have a much... It is a local mentality. You can't say that they are Polish. They are definitely not. But they've got a very particular sense of what it means to be them, their conception of Ukrainian. And it is extremely anti-Russian. It is anti-leftist. It is anti-Russian. Not that those two things are necessarily the same, because they're not anymore, although, historically they may have been. It's not that there is a huge pro-Western sentiment per se. That is very utilitarian. The West Ukrainian nationalists, ultranationalists, Banderite fascists, however you want to call them, they see the West as a means to an end, and ultimately they would actually seek to change the West to be more ultranationalist, Banderite fascists themselves. That's actually what a big part of what Azov is all about. Is they call it a conservative, meaning in their terms, fascist revolution that they want to see all across Europe. And these two conceptions of Ukrainian national identity have been going back and forth in various presidential elections since Ukrainian independence. And anyone who knows Ukraine knows that a definitive forcing of the country to go one way or the other, right, geopolitically speaking, because either one of you're either the Eastern Ukrainians want to be close to Russia, and the Western Ukrainians want to be as far away from Russia as possible, even if that means becoming, part of the West, part of NATO. So geopolitical orientation becomes intrinsically tied into that set. And the Ukrainian presidents until now, at least until the 2000s, have balanced that by basically staying neutral and not swinging too hard one way or the other. But first we saw the Orange Revolution, which swung to the west, a counter swing the other way with Yanukovych, a little, they call him pro-Russian. He wasn't, he was pro-Eastern Ukrainian oligarch. But certainly he didn't rabidly hate Russia, which is how that definition has came to mean. If you're pro-Russian, it means you don't
rabidly hate Russia.
And that's not only Ukraine; that's pretty much all over the world.
That's pretty well. The West is not the world, but that is part of definitely the Western mentality now. And of course, with the EU association agreement, originally pushed by Yanukovych, it must be said, and campaigned for him until he saw the final thousands of pages of neoliberal shock therapy diktat with no expected billions, tens of billions of dollars to help ameliorate the effects of the neoliberal shock therapy, the mass privatizations, the unemployment of tens of millions of Ukrainians. He said, no, I can't do this. I mean, well, first of all, it would destroy my political career and many others, and it would economically destroy the country. I can't do this. No, not like this, not without any help going with it, at least.
Exactly. And second, where's the money? I mean,
where's the money? Yeah, they were expecting at least $15 billion. They got nothing. So instead, he said, all right, well, let's see what Russia has because we're in bad economic shapes. And then the EU said, oh, no, you don't. And the openly West-backed Maidan Putsch, was brought to fruition, resulting in the civil conflict in the country when the Donbass and Crimea, and to a lesser extent, much of the rest of eastern Ukraine said, no, we don't want our government overthrown. Actually, we don't support the Maidan. And this is the big shocker. Oh, the revolution of dignity. All Ukrainians supported the ousting of the pro-Russian, dictator, whatever. Even the OSCE recognized that as the fairest election Ukraine has ever had. Yanukovych was by no means a saint. He was a corrupt SOB, just like every Ukrainian president was and has been after him. But, just as in the West, democracy in Ukraine was a choice of the lesser evil. And the people in East Ukraine overwhelmingly elected Yanukovych and those around him to prevent the people from Western Ukraine and who think like the stereotypical geographical divide, who have this anti-Russian mentality, from coming to power. And of course, they did. They just seized it rather than winning the next election that was scheduled in 2015. And this was over these protests over the EU association agreement, which Yanukovych backed out of at the last minute. And there was open help and even orchestration by not only the United States, but other European states as well, because, Yanukovych had fallen out of favor. He'd said, no, not yet. And that was not acceptable. They're in the negotiations for that. Ukraine already had an existing free trade agreement with the Commonwealth of Independent States, a free trade agreement with Russia. And Yanukovych and Russia came to the EU and they said, can we work out some kind of joint deal here to facilitate this? And the reply from the European Council president at the time was no. Ukraine needs to make a civilizational choice. And that's the exact words they did.
That's right.
And Ukraine, because they have this divided society, was not prepared to make that choice. Everyone knew that if they were forced to make that choice, there would be civil conflict in the country. There were actually science fiction conventions in Ukraine regularly talking about the future civil war in that scenario. It was known. Everyone knew it. I did a crisis scenario when I was doing my postgrad at the LSE in London. I ran a crisis scenario exactly on a civil war in Ukraine with Russia backing the East and the Crimea and NATO backing the West, because everyone knew it was coming if Ukraine was forced to make this decision. It was, and that's why there's still a conflict in the country. Russia has restricted that conflict by the amount of support they give eastern Ukraine to just this tiny corner of the Donbass. Why? Because they want to do their best not to alienate the rest of the Ukrainian population in the long term, particularly. Forget Western Ukraine. They know that's never going to. But they're thinking of central Ukraine and most of Eastern Ukraine. And yes, Russia's supporting the separatists there. You might even call them loyalists if you wanted, but the people who never accepted the Maidan Putsch in 2014 in eastern Ukraine. And of course, it's not just the people from Donbass. People came from all over Ukraine. There were tens of thousands of defections after the Maidan Putsch from the Ukrainian military, the security services, the police, to either Crimea and thus Russia directly, or to the Donbass, because they did not agree. And if you're wondering who are these Donbass militias, they're, for the most part, they're ex-military police and security services of eastern Ukraine, or even elsewhere in Ukraine that happen to share the hatred of not wanting to take the country in that direction. And that's where we still are today with the frozen conflict. And hence we have the election of, the comedian turned president backed by the oligarch Kolomoisky, Zelensky. And he was kind of viewed as a centrist candidate because the majority of Ukraine, other than West Ukraine, after a few years of a Maidan regime, they said, we don't want this anymore. This has been disastrous for us. Our economy has been ruined. We are now, on a per capita basis, the poorest country in Europe, poorer than Moldova. And that's saying something, right? That is the result. Our lives have gotten...
Yeah, as a person coming from Bulgaria, I can say, I can tell that, being below that line is really...
It's bad. So it was a throw the bums out. Now, Western Ukraine voted for Poroshenko, just like Eastern Ukraine voted for it became the opposition bloc candidate. That's what it's called now, the political representation of Eastern Ukraine. After the Maidan, there was an idea that we can't have a return to an failed orange revolution scenario when in 5 years we won't succeed and the country will just swing back the other way. So they had to politically purge the country. They lustrated the Party of Regions, the party that had been government. They banned the Communist Party, which had been in a loose coalition with the Party of Regions and was certainly opposed to the vision of West Ukrainian national identity, and several other, basically every leftist party in the country was banned. Socialist, communist, doesn't make any difference. All leftists, not just gone, they're banned. And that was done to make sure that they could rewrite. They would have years at the least to rewrite the political DNA of the country, enshrine it in law, take it in an irreversible direction out of the Russian orbit and into there. So to do that, they had to neuter all political representation of Eastern Ukraine. So that's what they did. Hence the lustrations, the banning, the pogroms, the beating of Eastern Ukrainian candidates in the presidential cycle. That wasn't an election, quote unquote, right? That it was not free. It was not fair. It was not just done at the barrel of a gun. It was done literally under the barrel of gun, grad, artillery piece, Banderite jackboot, active military zone across Ukraine, and with all of the Ukrainians who had fled to Russia and were living in Russia, and there were some 2 to 3 million Eastern Ukrainians that fled to aggressor Russia, right, from the Donbass and elsewhere in Eastern Ukraine after this. They weren't allowed to vote, right? Usually citizens abroad are allowed to vote. They're not allowed to vote in Ukrainian elections anymore, right? Get rid of them. And it must be said that with Crimea having a referendum to rejoin Russia, that took another 2 to 3 million, 2.5 million, say, pro-Russian, meaning Eastern Ukrainian votes out, perhaps permanently shifting the balance of political power in the country, which has been a problem, but it was judged the less strategic loss. And full disclosure, my wife is Crimean. All right. My mother-in-law, my family in-laws, they live in Simferopol, and we have family, extended family all across Eastern Ukraine, Kharkov,
Donbass, Odessa. So I will never say that I'm not biased one way or another, but I also do bring a bit of perspective of what the people of Eastern Ukraine, who are habitually denied all agency, they're all just Russians or pro-Russians, and they're not really human beings in the Western media and commentariat. Well, I do have a bit of insight into the thought process there. And of course, it's not 100%, right? These are general geographic stereotypes that have real reflections in polls and elections and everything. But of course, there's always the odd Eastern Ukrainian Banderite fascist and the odd communist from Lvov. It does happen. So these are generalizations, but with real reasons behind them. Zelensky came to power on a promise to end the war in Donbass without actually being extremely vague on how he would do it. And his years in office, he started with just a couple of years now, he started with a 75% approval rating. Throw the bums out. Someone new, supposedly uncorrupt, despite Kolomoisky, the reality there. And, Ukraine quickly became disenchanted with him. He did nothing to improve the economy. He did nothing to end the war in Donbass. He found himself restricted. He could not go, even if he wanted to, against the far right in Ukraine, the militias, right? We're talking Azov, right sector, C-14 and everything, because he came to realize very quickly that the Maidan regime, the regime that he inherited, depended on them for its continued survival and control in the country. That's why Avakov stayed on as interior minister, to keep them, in line more or less. And they were integrated into the military, the security services, the police, and of course peppered through the Rada. And they always, this propaganda from Russia about fascists in Ukraine, they usually dismiss it as Nazis. Well, okay, they're not Nazis. And let's be clear. They are not Nazis. They are West Ukrainian ultranationalists who aspire to the fascism of Stefan Bandera and the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. And they want their own particular Ukrainian fascism. And at World War II, they were more than willing to ally with Nazi Germany to get that, right? And yes, they fought the communists, meaning they were happy to kill other Ukrainians who did not want to be part of a Ukrainian fascist state allied with Nazi Germany.
And this seems to be repeated. I mean, the situation seems to be repeating itself right now. I saw one of your comments on Twitter where you said that America is going to keep fighting the Russian influence in Ukraine until the last West Ukrainian kills the last East Ukrainian, right?
So they are perfectly willing and glad to do that. And right now, the Western Ukrainians are, the nationalists, at least among them.
But let me just ask one more question here, because from what you said, I mean, your summation here looks like the fascists, particularly the kind of armed groups like Azov or the Right Sector, all kinds of other militant organizations, they sort of terrorize the country by being part of its institutional base right now, and this is how the regime prevails.
Yeah, and there's the idea that they say, oh, look how the far right parties, I mean the explicit party of the Right Sector and these Azov groups, they do very poor in elections. Well, that's easily explainable because they're peppered all through Timoshenko's Fatherland Party, but particularly Poroshenko's European Solidarity Party. Poroshenko was not a Banderite fascist when he became power. By the end, he re-ran on an ultra-nationalist, anti-Russian language, pro-independent Ukrainian, autocephalous church. He ran as an ultra-nationalist, and that's where he finds himself today. Why? Because they're trying to manufacture an anti-Russian Russian-Ukrainian nation. All nation building, right? And nations are built. They have some organic components, but they are built, by political elites and a whole bunch of wars, institutions, and so on. But you need some historical basis. Well, if you look back through Ukrainian history, there is very little basis for an anti-Russian Ukrainian national identity. All they've got is these World War II era Nazi collaborators, Bandera, the OUN, Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and so on. And so they have to keep going back to that because that's all they've got as the historical foundation for this, new Ukrainian national identity. And it has to be said, the US, the West in general, particularly the US, has been supporting Ukrainian fascists right since the end of World War II, right? I mean, all through the 50s, the Forrest brothers, all of this, they've welcomed them. There are actually, across the US and Canada, where a lot of West Ukrainians fled in the aftermath of the aftermath of World War II, there are monuments to Nazi collaborators, to Ukrainian fascists all over the US and Canada, right? And most people don't even have any idea that they're there. They're just some Ukrainians, but they don't know anything about it. And yes, they are fascists. They are not Nazis in that, they don't want to see the return of Adolf Hitler. They want a Ukrainian fascist anti-Russian state. And then so that's why they keep going back to this, the Stefan Bandera was a national hero stuff that Eastern Ukrainians will never accept. Zelensky,
and it's also difficult. Let me just weigh in that it's also difficult for the Polish to accept that, and the Polish are kind of forced by geopolitical because of geopolitical configurations. They have to support Western Ukrainians, which is like also a crazy situation.
Absolutely the same with Israel.
Yeah. Okay, but let's try and see
now.
Yeah, because you said that Volodymyr Zelensky wasn't able to fulfill any of his campaign promises just because he, right after he was elected, he started figuring out that nothing depends on him. Everything's in the hands of either the oligarchs or the right-wing militias or, whatever, but he can do pretty much nothing. His hands are tied. So he kept doing nothing, but suddenly now he seems to be to have woken up, and it's got to be for a reason. And I'm just trying to figure out what is the kind of the intimate thought, so to say, behind this action, this statements, how he's going to retake Crimea or how they're going to restore the integrity, the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And of course, Crimea is out of question. I suppose that some people, some elements in Ukraine imagine that actually a major offensive, military offensive on the self-proclaimed republics is possible. But I don't know whether they realize what would be the cost of it. But why did it happen? I mean, is this someone from the West incentivized him to do that? Because when I look at him, it just seems very, very kind of. He seems to be on the one hand desperate, on the other hand, not really wanting to do that, or not really not being able to manage this situation, particularly when let alone this statement that Ukraine has to now join NATO immediately to prevent war, which is meaningless. But then this desperate phone calls. Okay, Stoltenberg, Trudeau, Boris Johnson.
Okay, so first of all, let's be clear that there are pro-Western liberals in Ukraine too. Right? They were a big part of the Maidan. They might have even been the majority, even if they weren't, shall we say, the vanguard. The vanguard were the Banderites. But there was a project, an unholy coalition of the pro-Western liberals and the ultranationalists because their interests coincided in joining together against the, not anti-Russian Eastern Ukrainian political representation. And this is the area where Zelensky comes out of, right? He is a comedian. He's from Dnipropetrovsk, Eastern Ukraine, in actuality, and he's of Jewish ancestry himself. Is he a Banderite? No. Has he found himself forced to be in bed with them? Yes. And so this unholy collaboration between the pro-Western liberals and the Banderite fascists, the Western Ukrainian ultra-nationalists, has become permanent now. It's become fused, right, to keep power. And that's where they find themselves today. That's why Zelensky has been forced to take this all on board. He wanted to end the war in Donbass, but the most basic of the Minsk requirements, step one, is to sit down with the political authorities of Donbass, of Donetsk and Lugansk, and start a political reconciliation. He can't do that, right? No leader of the Maidan regime in Kiev, which he inherited, can do that, because that immediately puts them on a more or less more equal level, rather than just Russian terrorists. And that immediately calls into question what happened on the Maidan, how power was seized in the country, the fact that it was unconstitutional, that it was illegal, that it was violent, that still there's these unanswered questions, that it's pretty clear that it was actually, the Banderites themselves, with sniper fire from the hotel Maidan that actually did this. That's why there has been no one actually charged with the Maidan in 7 years, because it's quite clear that it wasn't, the majority of the killings weren't from the Yanukovych, police,
Berkut.
Yeah, the Berkut, the version of the Oman there. He can't sit down with them, because it would immediately call into question the legitimacy of everything that has happened to the Maidan, and the whole house of cards would come falling apart. So it's long been accepted by the Kiev regime political elite, that they can't fulfill Minsk. Never mind that it was agreed to at one point to stop, the Russian-supported East Ukrainians from overrunning, Kiev, which was at least a possibility at one point. They can't fulfill any of the terms of Minsk, despite it being now enshrined in a UN Security Council resolution. And if you read the Western media and the commentariat, they're always now talking about how Russia, or because they don't grant the Donbass any agency at all, that they have to. Russia is refusing to amend Minsk, or necessary changes to Minsk. What necessary changes? You're backing out of the deal that you made, to save your regime at one point, and now they will never fulfill it. It will never.
And also it's these those weird acrobatics, like, oh, but we can't have it in Minsk anymore. Now we have to have it in a Western country because Minsk after the protest. Oh, this is just like everybody can see that what they're trying to do is they're just sort of trying to depart from the Minsk agreements. They can't do that in an open manner, so they have to maneuver in this weird way. I don't know where it's going to lead to, but
so on top of not being able to end the war, not being able to fulfill the Minsk agreements, the economy, of course, has been a mess. Europe is not investing any money in Ukraine, and will not, because Ukraine has nothing that Europe wants or needs. So the economy, their biggest trading partner before this state trading partner was Russia, and Russia's still, despite everything, their biggest state trading partner today, right? So bad economic situation, not improved. Then you get hit with the coronavirus pandemic, right? They haven't been able to deal with it. The restrictions that Zelensky made were not popular in Ukraine, of course, because there was no government money going to help people stay at home. And so that was extremely unpopular. And no vaccine.
They refused the Sputnik 5, right?
Sputnik because it's hybrid warfare. We can't accept a Russian virus because, again, it would call into legitimacy our anti-Russian direction of the nation. Better dead than red, or better dead than Russian in this case. So they had to accept, because they found out they're not a real high priority for the West, really, at the end of the day. And so they found themselves at the very bottom of not even on the list to get vaccines. So they finally got a small supply, just a small amount from India, from a vaccine that is acknowledged in the Indian press to be basically just a cheap secondhand copy of AstraZeneca, which has its own problems. So a whole lot of domestic problems. Zelensky's approval has dropped from 75% to 30%, and his party, the Servant of the People, even lower. So he's in bad political states. By some polls now, the most popular party in the country now is the opposition bloc, Platform for Life, which is the successor, if you will, the reconstituted party of regions, or political representation of Eastern Ukraine. Medvedchuk's star is on the rise. Zelensky's star was going down. This is why they then banned Eastern Ukrainian media. Essentially, they started shutting down TV stations, very democratic, because they threaten our values. What? Whose values? What are you talking about, right? They're in the Western media, it's always pro-Russian media, meaning
of course.
Ukrainian. Yeah. Eastern Ukrainians are not only allowed political representation, they're not allowed a voice in the media, right? They're not even allowed their own media now. And now they've personally gone after the head of the opposition party Platform for Life, Medvedchuk. He's an oligarch, so is every other political player in Ukrainian politics. But now they're charging him with the politicized treason, because, again, they can't allow a resuscitation of Eastern Ukrainian political representation when the country is, in such a state with an unpopular president and the conflict still in the east. So Zelensky finds himself with all these domestic problems, crises. There's a constitutional crisis in the country between Zelensky and the Constitutional Court. The U.S. was demanding anti-corruption reforms in order to keep the IMF spigot open. Of course, Zelensky was using these to specifically target East Ukrainian oligarchs. The Constitutional Court therefore found them unacceptable. He's trying to get rid of all the people on the Constitutional Court, which of course is unconstitutional to do. So there's a constitutional crisis along with the political crisis, the economic crisis, the pandemic. Zelensky finds himself in a very bad situation. Enter Nord Stream 2. This pipeline going from Russia to Germany, a second pipeline, bypassing existing pipelines across Ukraine and Poland, will instead take gas, again, under the Baltic Sea, basically voiding the need for those pipelines across Ukraine and Poland. The regime in Kiev views Nord Stream 2 as an existential threat to their continued rule of the country. Two reasons: no political leverage over Russia, geopolitical leverage, if you will. Because when Ukraine couldn't pay its own gas bills before, it would cut off the flow of gas to Europe. Or it would siphon off gas meant for Europe for their own use. This is why Germany is so strongly behind the pipeline, because they don't want Ukraine hanging over their energy security either. That's why they've agreed to it, and they're resisting all the U.S. pressure, the sanctions against them, everything else, to continue with this. But those pipelines not only have political leverage, gas transit fees. Ukraine and Poland are both paid money to transit that gas, right? Which comes out of two ends. It comes at a cost to the Russians and also an end cost to the German energy consumers. Last year, gas transit fees were 18% of the Ukrainian national budget. They lose that 18%, their failing economy completely fails, right? It becomes unsustainable. They cannot allow that gas pipeline to be created. And that's why Putin has referred to it, this, getting rid of Nord Stream 2, as the U.S. saying, you have to continue your economic subsidization of our geopolitical project in Ukraine. In order to get that killed, all right, we had this Navalny psyop, the most deadly poison in the universe, which he miraculously survived. Nonsense.
And now he's got some problems with his backbone, but he's still
backbone, a hernia, everything. All right, okay, all this nonsense. He's a Western asset, on top of being far right. Yeah, all right. Let's ignore that drama show there. It didn't have the effect they wanted. The German government still refused to change, to ban it. So, brings us to the current restoration of conflicts, of the unfreezing of the frozen conflict in the East, the ending of the ceasefire. No matter what they say, Ukraine, the government, the Kiev regime, has been moving military forces to the front line in Donbass since early March. I was talking about it. Lots of other people online were talking about it even then. So a month now, they've been moving at their speed, tanks, artillery, ballistic missiles, thousands of conscripts to the east, and it's ongoing to this day, right? And Russia, late in the day, in the last couple of weeks, has started their own buildup, of course, under the guise of exercises there, as a deterrent, right? Saying, do not try to restart this conflict. Politically, settle this per Minsk. As is now enshrined in UN Security Council resolutions, we will not allow you to do this. And it has to be said that the Ukrainian army, at least on paper, is 250,000 people now. And they've had some degree of weapons and training and so on from NATO now. Whereas in the Donbass, the militias there, the armed forces, if you will, are some 30,000 under arms, right? Of course, their mobilization and so on. But does the regime in Kiev really believe, does Zelensky believe that he can retake Donbass by force? No, of course not. Of course, he knows. First of all, they probably couldn't even do it on their own, certainly not without an ethnic cleansing genocide of large portions of the Donbass population. Now, there are Western Ukrainians who are fully behind that idea. Drive them all into Russia or kill them. But that's not Zelensky's necessarily line of thinking. So why are they building up forces there? Do they intend a conflict, right? And Russia is a reaction to that, is a deterrent. If even serious American military and political analysts. I was just listening to a debate from the Center for New American Security, which is kind of a bipartisan reforming of the old Project for a New American Century. They were talking, and you had some like Michael Kaufman and a few others, and they were grudgingly admitting, a guy from Carnegie, Russia, they were grudgingly admitting that everything Russia is doing now is deterrent. Even though they were loath to say exactly why. They were very cautious around that. They admit that. This is not a Russian invasion. This is not done because of Russian domestic politics, right? It's not going to improve Putin's approval rating, which doesn't really need approval anyway. It's not to secure a water supply for Crimea. Remember that the Kiev regime built a dam to cut off the flow of water to Crimea, a crime against humanity, water deprivation, in order to collectively punish the people of Crimea for choosing wrong. It's not about that. That would create more problems. It would create a huge border of a less totally pro-Russian population that would need to be policed. And Russia has already invested very heavily in desalinization to try to solve the water problem. That even they admit it's nonsense. That's not the real reason. Only propagandists talk about things like that. It's not to seize the rest of Donbass or East Ukraine. Russia doesn't want that, right? The Russian finance ministry is really not happy even with the situation as it is now, because at least in the finance ministry, they're neoliberals, not necessarily in the rest of the Russian government.
but they don't want to pay to raise eastern Ukraine to the Russian standard of living. It would be disastrously. There's already Russians who have complained for a long time, stop feeding the Caucasus. Why are you giving more money to them and not to me? Why are you giving money to Chechnya? Why would you give money to Donbass or Dnipropetrovsk or Kherson rather than to some of Russia's own regions, right? It's politically unacceptable in Russia, and the government is well aware of that. So it's not to another land grab. It's not for water. It's not. It's a deterrent. It's to stop Kiev from attacking Donbass, and it's to get them to return to the agreements that were agreed upon, brokered by France, Germany, and Russia. Russia's not a party to them. It's supposed to be an agreement between Kiev and Donbass.
Yeah,
So
Russia's supposed to secure it together with France. And,
that's not the way they present it, because, of course, the East Ukrainians, they don't have political agency, of course. Western Ukrainians, backed by the U.S., Kiev, they have political agency. It's nonsense. So why are they doing this? And I'll tell you why. They do want to restart at least a limited conflict there. Kiev does. It's a desperate play. Desperate play. They want a restoration of a conflict. And what they want is to create enough of a conflict for Russia to intervene directly. Not because they believe they can take Donbass back. Not because they even want Donbass back. Do you think the politically fragile regime in Kiev right now wants another 3 to 4 to 5 million Eastern Ukrainian voters?
who are gonna, of course, oppose them and maybe
would have to
take
prevent
up
them from
arms
voting
against
for
them.
a decade. They would have to, build up, concentration camps, right? No, they don't want that. They don't actually want Donbass back in or Crimea. They have to say they do for, domestic political ultranational
and propaganda purposes.
They don't want it. So what are they doing? One, they want Russia to intervene directly, to have to protect Donbass. One, to use that as pressure to force Germany to kill Nord Stream 2, right? If there's a renewed conflict and Russia is invading Ukraine again, that's the way it will be portrayed, then it's even harder. And you have to remember that German elections are coming up, and the U.S. is really pushing the German Green Party. And however much I have green environmental sentiments myself, the Green Party in Germany, as even members of Angela Merkel's party have said, are a front for the Americans and have American geopolitical goals there. They don't want Nord Stream 2. So they're trying to use this as pressure to kill Nord Stream 2. Two, to help Zelensky's flagging approval, a rally around the flag to get all of Poroshenko's, ultranationalists, his West Ukrainians, back on board to supporting Zelensky, at least for the time being. Number three is, to satisfy this ultranationalist desire for conflict, because we just had an incident where the Zelensky, the Ukrainian presidential residence, was under, protest, but really under siege. The building was covered in graffiti, of course, including swastikas on it, completely, unreported by the Western press there. So, this combination of domestic politics and they've got a green light from the Biden administration to do this, which they didn't have with the Trump administration. Trump himself, right? Forget Pompeo and the other neocons running his foreign policy. He himself didn't care about the Ukraine one way or the other. Biden was viceroy over Ukraine for Obama. Biden re-brought Victoria Nuland, who was one of the architects of the Maidan, back into his government, right? They realize they have more support now. Just in the last week, 350 tons of U.S. military gear were delivered to the port in Odessa, directly adding fuel to this fire, right, of
this military escalation to the east. And they're trying to present all of this as Russian aggression. Russia is building up. Yes, Russia is building up forces on its border with Ukraine now, late in the game, because Ukraine was building up forces.
Yeah, it's a reaction.
Also on the Russian border to do this. And even the serious U.S. military analysts acknowledge that this is not an invasion force. It's not the way it's constituted. It's not near enough troops, and it's not the type of equipment on board, that this is about deterrence and coercion. The coercion aspect being don't attack Donbass and return to the Minsk agreement. And
okay. I see. Thanks, Mark, for this very insightful explanation. Last minute of our program, I just want to get what's your speculation, let's call it. Do you think Russia can resist these provocations? Or do you think that, it's been enough? Like, obviously Russia, and not only Russia, China, by the way, as well, they've demonstrated recently that they've had enough, that, it's just they can't bear with this kind of treatment from the West anymore.
Yeah. By Russia's own doing, they have helped some 700,000 people of Donbass to get Russian citizenship. They have dual citizenship now, effectively. Yeah. And politically, just domestically politically, Russia can't allow Russian citizens to be killed in mass, at least, in Donbass. If the conflict there is restarted, and I believe it will, it's a couple weeks away yet. The weather's not right yet, not till the end of April. There's too much mud and slush still in eastern Ukraine and Russia. But I believe they're still building towards that. I still believe they've got a green light from Russia. I think that Germany is quietly trying to talk them down a little bit. I don't believe that will ultimately have an effect, because the German government is disaligned with their interests on Nord Stream 2 here, which is one of their principal motivations. They're going to try to restart this. The time frame is somewhere from the end of April to the beginning of July. That's what we're looking at. And Russia will feed the need to intervene if it becomes too big and the militias in Donbass can't hold, which, they don't have any strategic depth. There's nowhere for them to retreat to. It's literally Donetsk City. So it's a tough defending situation there. And if Russia intervenes, will NATO intervene? No. It will be the Georgia scenario then. It will be, you go, we've got your back. Oh, damn, good luck with that. Why? Yeah. Because they want Russia to intervene, again, to kill Nord Stream 2. And also, here's the evil thinking kicker behind the thoughts in Kiev and the US. How do you ultimately prevent a political sentiment in Ukraine switching back the other way, and the geopolitical orientation of Ukraine? If Russian armed forces overtly intervene and are seen as killing thousands of Ukrainian conscripts from all over Ukraine, that's it. Then that is a permanent dividing line. That is why Russia has resisted that till now, right? And that is what they are desperately trying to avoid and are running out of room to avoid now. That is the bad situation. Yes, Russia could wipe up the Ukrainian military. It would not receive, on the ground military support. They would get ISR and everything else, but they wouldn't have NATO troops on the ground. It's not a NATO treaty member. Yes, there's not many sanctions left, but they would cut Russia off from SWIFT and everything else. That's not a deterrent. But killing thousands of Ukrainians and causing permanent Ukrainian hatred, national hatred of Russia, all across Ukraine, not just Western Ukraine, it's a bad situation. And Russia
definitely
is trying to avoid it, and I hope that it can be avoided. I've got family in East Ukraine. I don't want to see this kick off. So that's why Russia is trying really hard to impress with a buildup on the border. Don't go down this path. But their options from the political thinking of both sides, from the regime in Kiev, from their point of view, and from the Kremlin, options are dwindling out of
That's right.
the
That's right.
logical situation.
Okay, thanks again, Mark Sleboda, for this analysis. I definitely hope that this is going to help our viewers and listeners to understand the situation in the region and the ongoing conflict between Russia, Ukraine, Russia, United States, facilitated kind of in Ukraine a little better. Thank you once again, and I'll see you again, hopefully, on the barricades.
Absolutely.